And the Torah portion, of course, this is part 2. And last night we started with re'eh, which is see. And I told a story about Billy Idol and Henny Penny. And I've been telling you guys about our neighbors and how we had to babysit the chickens and so forth while they were gone. And interesting little creatures they are, but how they've started following us over to our house if they see us. I think now they think it's just one big shared property, and they'll just slip right under the fence. And we had all the ducks over here the other day. But as it turned out, the story of Billy Idol and Henny Penny fit very well with this week's Torah portion once I figured out the thread that I wanted to pick up for this year at least. And that was of idolatry. And the reason I went ahead and picked it up, it was almost like a challenge. The past few years, I've looked at that section and I thought, you know, we really need to figure out what idolatry is. Because we don't have little idols in our houses, I think we tend to dismiss that great commandment. You know, you shall have no other gods before me. I am the Lord your God. And if that's so important that it's all the way from Genesis to Revelation, then it applies to us too. It's just our job to figure out where our idolatry lies if it's not in, you know, worshiping something that's carved or formed from human hands. And I think it's a little harder, but then that made me think of the garden. There wasn't really a carved image there. There was a tree, there was a serpent, there was a beast. And so I think in our situation maybe is just as subtle as it was in the garden. It wasn't presented as an outright idol. It was presented with and so let me do something right quick that I think will help. If there's Colleen. Okay, Colleen, I am making you co-host so that you can check the hot mics once I pull up the PowerPoints, and that'll help. Okay, where was I? At any rate, I have deliberately avoided this because it's such a slippery topic. And I think for me it is. I mean, like, where's my idolatry? And as it turns out, I can look back over my life and see where I have been guilty of idolatry simply because I was worshiping my own self-will, which is what it was all about to begin with. And once we can start to look at that for what it is, I think it'll be easier for us to identify the idolatry. That's what can be so hard if it's not as simple as getting rid of a figurine of a fertility goddess. You know, we've tossed out the Easter eggs and the Christmas trees, but it's deeper than that. Those are the easy things. Idolatry is deeper and harder than we think it is. And so I've deliberately avoided it because it's such a slippery topic up until this year. And this year I'm like, now I'm going to punch back on this one. It's time to take up the sword here and to do some whacking, even if we whack some areas that don't need whacking. That's what happens when you start trying to clear the path where people can see more clearly behind you. Sometimes you make mistakes. When you clear a path, you might cut down something you didn't intend to cut down. But the people who are coming after you will have a clearer view, and they'll have, I think, a more precise view. So this year, I'm willing to whack a few things that don't need to be whacked if it clears for you guys to even see from what I've cleared out, if you can see something much more precise than this. So let me share the screen. And I'll start from, do I want to do this? You know what? I want to start at the end. And so what I'm going to do is escape back and go here. And this is just an example of, we'll go back and pick up where we left off last night. But sometimes we get really great questions over the Torah portions. I'm not that, thrilled with questions that don't have anything to do with the current week's Torah portion, because that's where I'm throwing all my energy and effort. And so if somebody sticks in a question about the Torah portion even before class, it just gives me twinkle toes, because it gives us a chance to look at something that's immediately relevant to everyone. And so I got a great question this morning from someone. I took her name out because I don't have her permission to use her name, but I'm going to use her question because I thought it was a great question. And in summary, the question was, if it's a sin to drink blood, which our Torah portion reminds us, we shall not drink the blood, then why did Yeshua want his disciples to drink his blood? And so I just copied and pasted my answer. It wasn't elaborate, but I think it reinforces the idea that when I show you how to use these rules, these hermeneutical rules in class, it's not so easy to learn how to do it yourself. But if you'll learn to do it yourself, even if it doesn't help the first 10 times you try to do it yourself, keep trying to do it yourself, because once you figure it out, you got it, and you can use it ever after. And so all I did was take that phrase, drink my blood, and I put it into that Blue Letter Bible word search so I could make sure it was something that's accessible to anybody, and you don't need special applications or money to use it or anything. It's just something free you can use. So I put drink my blood into Blue Letter Bible under, I believe, NASB. It would probably work with KJV. I didn't try it, but it did work with the NASB version. And it pulled up for me a list of contexts that use those three words in the same verse. And the first one I found in the list was 1 Chronicles 11:18 through 19. So I'm counting that as the first mention, not just as part of a progressive mention. I'm also counting that as first mention because it's the first one it gave me. And here's the context. It says, so the three, okay, creation, gospel, people right now, you see a number and you instantly have a picture in your head of resurrection, because 3 is the number of resurrection, spirit of counsel. So the 3 broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water from the well of Bethlehem, which was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. And I don't know that it's a coincidence that it was the well of Bethlehem, the water from Bethlehem, and that Yeshua was born in Bethlehem. And it says they took it and they brought it to David. Nevertheless, David would not drink it, but poured it out to the Lord. And he said, be it far from me before my God that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives? For at the risk of their lives, they brought it. Therefore, he would not drink it. These things the 3 mighty men did. So this is a strange little story, an interesting little story that I'm sure children would read, and that would be entertaining. But when we see that number 3, and that it's 3 mighty men, and we know 3 is the number of resurrection, but we can also see the use of drinking a person's blood here as a metaphor, not as something to be taken literally. And I know we tend to get hyper literal with biblical texts because we don't want to be deceived into thinking, well, it's just a, it's not all a metaphor. It's not all symbology and so forth. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is symbolic. And this is a great example because I think within Orthodox Judaism, this is one of the objections they have to Yeshua, because he made this comment about drinking blood. But if you apply the rules of hermeneutics and you go back to the first mention of drinking a person's blood, you can see that David did not literally mean he would have drank their blood if he drank that water. He would have been partaking of their sacrifice, because at great risk to their lives did they go and obtain that water, because he was longing for the water of Bethlehem. And so as a metaphor, whatever you're drinking can actually stand for the blood or the risk that brought it to your hands. So it's not literal blood the three men are bringing to David. They're not cutting a gash in their wrists and saying, here, David, drink this. That's not what's happening. And he realizes if he drinks this water, then he's approving of this great sacrifice that they have made for him by endangering their own lives for nothing more than his desire for a drop of water from Bethlehem. So he's like, no, I'm not going to share that cup. It wasn't worth risking their lives just to cater to my little whim of wanting a drink of water from Bethlehem. And so he managed to honor them at the same time that he refused to drink their blood. In other words, to approve risking your own life, a human life, just to get somebody a drink of water, a special drink of water. So when Yeshua says, you know, if you will drink my blood, what is he saying? He's offering them a cup of wine, as far as I can tell. It's either going to be water or wine with him. With him, it could be water, but it could also be wine. But they're sharing a cup. There's a liquid in the cup. And he's talking about a great sacrifice that he's about to make for them. And he's asking them to approve of this sacrifice by sharing the cup. And so what is he saying? I want you to share in this selfless sacrifice. I'm about to do something very courageous, like the men who went to obtain the water from the well of Bethlehem, who endangered their lives. I'm endangering my very life. And I'm counting on a resurrection. When I, you know, carry this out to the end, it's going to cost me my life, at least for a time, you know, at least for 3 days. And so I wanted to use that as an example of a great question. When you bring up that question in the context of the Torah portion we're on, it really gives us a great opportunity, I think, to get deeper into the Torah portion. Okay, now let me try to backtrack. Let's see. There it goes. It's just cranky. Now we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. Okay. It'd be great to have an editor, wouldn't it? Okay, now we're going to start at the beginning. So the Torah portion is Re'eh, or see, and there's your scripture references. And you already know about our next door neighbor, chickens. And out of all the chickens that were over there, there was a little red hen that I named Henny Penny, because she was very friendly. She would just come right up to me and eat out of my hand. And I named her Henny Penny, and I didn't really think about the story of Henny Penny until I started putting this lesson together. But there was red, there was black, and then there was this odd white hen. And they nicknamed her Billie Idol because she had this real spiky hairdo, like the rock star Billie Idol. And out of all the chickens that were over there, there was that one little red hen, Henny Penny, and Billie Idol, that were very adventurous. Those were the ones most likely to be in our garage if the garage door was open. And so since, you know, they got to know us while the neighbors were gone, they started spending more and more time over here. And they just started feeding in our garden as much as they fed in their own. And they'd slip right under that fence and come eat bugs over here. And there was a problem with that because there's a game trail along that fence line. And where there's a game trail, it might be something as harmless as a deer, but it might be something else. And so we'd try to shoo them, you know, where they'd go back home, but then we'd look back out there and there they'd be. And so they were attracted, I'm sure, by lack of competition because the other chickens weren't that big on crossing under the fence. But they kept going farther and farther down that old game trail that goes along our fence. And the game trail ends in an old deadfall, which is where, you know, trees have fallen over, dead bushes and those sorts of things, they just kind of pile up. And there's a little kind of a hole where the game trail goes into the deadfall. And that told us that most likely Mr. and Mrs. Fox had taken up residence there. We have a family across the street, and then we have a family that lives over here in the deadfall. And sometimes late in the evening, if you're really still and you're really strategic about where you're sitting, you can watch them play. They'll play just like puppies with each other. But last Thursday night, Henny Penny and Billie Idol went missing. And the neighbors texted me the next morning, have you seen Billie Idol? Have you seen the little red hen? They didn't come in to roost last night and we couldn't find them this morning. And I said, well, I'll go look. And Alan went one way and I went the other way. I went down the game trail, and when I went down the game trail, that's what I found. I found feathers that matched the description of the missing chickens. So last night we talked about how Torah is freedom. It is liberty, just like James wrote to us. But the liberty of the Torah is found within it, not outside of it. Even the Garden of Eden is called a locked garden or a sealed up garden. It says it's like a sealed up fountain. And so it's a place of life. And when you venture outside the boundary, then you risk losing life. Because inside the sealed garden, there's life. Outside the sealed garden, there's death. And we know that when Adam and Eve sinned, they lost the key that would have allowed them to remain in the garden. They had to leave. And so in the Torah portion, I believe Moses is trying to teach the Israelites this transition lesson, that if by this point, after 40 years in the wilderness, the word of Adonai has not transformed you all the way down to your heart, then you may not be able to handle this huge responsibility that you're about to step into. And one of the main changes that was taking place is no longer would they bring the shlamim offerings that are brought at the feasts. They can be brought for other reasons too. But if they wanted to eat meat, they had to take it into the Mishkan and slaughter it there. And then they had to give out the portions. They had to share the meat. And so now, as they're going into the land, they're about to be given this great privilege and this great freedom of slaughtering, kosher slaughtering their own animals. If they want to eat meat, as long as it's a kosher animal, and as long as they properly slaughter it, then they're free to do that wherever they live. They're not going to have to bring it up to Jerusalem. They're not going to have to bring it to the temple. They'll only have to bring their sacrificial offerings to the temple. But just for everyday food, they now have the freedom and the responsibility of it. And that's the thing about freedom. It comes with great responsibility. And so after 40 years, I think Moses is telling them, you know what, you've had me looking over your shoulder every move you've made. And you really didn't have a choice about giving out portions when you brought your meat to slaughter. But now I'm sending you out there by yourself. And it's going to be up to you whether you continue to give portions when you make a kosher slaughter, not for sacrificial purposes, and that too. But the most important thing is the transition. Now you can just, if you want to have barbecue, you can have barbecue. But let's see if you've internalized the lesson of sharing your portions. And just like the farmers, they hadn't been farming. But now they would be farmers, and they would have the freedom to choose how big the size of the corners of their fields were that were supposed to be left for the poor. Now that they have this great freedom, they can be as stingy as they want to be and have a corner that's an inch big, or they can leave a corner that's, you know, I don't know what the measurements were back then, 100 yards big. It's up to them. And so that's the transition. Will you continue to share your portions? Will you enlarge your corners? Will you obey the spirit of the Torah? Not just keep the technical details. And in the wilderness journey, what had built was a sense of community. They first needed 40 years of being a community before they were ready for the responsibility of maintaining the sense of community when they had the freedom to scatter. Moses didn't want them to see themselves as disconnected free individuals. And that's why he trained them at the Ohel Moed, which is the tent of meeting. And just like Moedim is your feasts. And so if they could learn this lesson in 40 years, then when he turned them loose in the land of Israel, then hopefully they would continue to observe the feasts, and they would continue to observe the principles of the Ohel Moed, even in a personal slaughter. And that is a practice, by the way, giving out portions when you slaughter an animal. That's a custom that endured into the 1900s, both by the Assyrian Christians, who were likely descendants of the lost tribes, and also by Jews of the Middle East. When they slaughtered an animal, they sent out portions, especially to their spiritual leaders. For the Christians, a pastor, a priest, whatever you call it, and then the same for the Persian and, say, Iraqi Jews. They would send portions to their rabbi or, prominent religious people within their community. Even if there was a kosher butcher, it was a mitzvah to teach that kosher slaughter to your sons. And so what we decided to do last night, or I decided to do, just dragged everybody with me. I wanted to look at these important bullet points that are within the Torah portion. There's a recap of the Chagim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot that are going to be observed in Jerusalem, including the tithes of those three feasts. Now, there's going to be homework, and in the slide after the homework, I inserted 2 charts that will break down for you the tithes, because the tithes are complicated. It's not as simple as in the church, you just give a tenth. In the land, the tithes are a little more complicated. And so I put what I think is a really clear chart in the very back of the slides. There's also an instruction to thoroughly destroy the idols and even idolaters who might be family within the land of Israel. There's the instructions for slaughtering the meat for personal consumption. Yes, you get to slaughter, for your own barbecue. It reiterates the list of kosher animals. It has information about the Shemitah year, when if you have an indentured Hebrew servant, you need to dismiss him in that 7th year along with his wife and children so they can return to their own inheritance in the land. And if you look at how much real estate is occupied by these 4 bullet points and the points that would go in those categories, it's most of the Torah portion. And so that was our question last night. If idolatry is such a big deal, then we need to know more about it in 2020. Because it still talks about idolatry in the book of Revelation, so there's still idolatry out there. And I don't think it's all Buddha statues in Asian restaurants. I think it's bigger than that. I think it's much more prevalent than that. But especially in the United States, I think it's much more subtle than that. And so we want to move past just mentally saying, yes, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. I recognize the oneness and the all supreme power of the Holy One. And then there is no God other than him. There are angels that are appointed over certain principalities and so forth that we see in the book of Daniel, but they are all subservient to him. They are created beings where he is the eternal. How do we move past agreeing with that statement to applying the statement, since it's the greatest commandment? And so I reviewed this. We've gone over this before, but I wanted to show you 2 particular things in this passage of 1 Kings 21, 1 through 3. And we know the great idolaters of Israel were Ahab and Jezebel. And Jezebel even comes up in the book of Revelation. Because now, we can see her as an archetype and how she corrupts the morals of Israel. And, and how Israel is basically the enabler, or maybe it's the opposite. You have to have a Jezebel if you have an Ahab. And if you have an Ahab, you have to have a Jezebel. They don't really work independently of one another. So you have to have, that works as a team. They work in tandem. It says, but after these things, Nabot, whose name means fruits, the Jezreelite had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel beside the palace of Ahab. That's important because it was right beside the palace, and Ahab could see it every single day. King of Samaria. Ahab spoke to Nabot and said, give me your vineyard that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it's close beside my house. That's the whole idea. I can see it every day. It's close. It's convenient. And I'll give you a better vineyard than it in its place. If you like, I'll give you the price of it in money. But Nabot said to Ahab, the Lord forbid me that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And see, that's the whole idea to going into the land of Israel, is to take your inheritance, enter into your inheritance, and not to lose it. But if you do lose it, he's got all sorts of ways of getting you back to it. Whether it's in a Shemitah year, whether it's in a Yovel year, he has ways to return you to your inheritance. Nabot has no reason to forfeit his inheritance. And he's saying, if the whole point of the Torah is getting me back to my inheritance, then why would I voluntarily give it up? And so the convenience of Nabot's vineyard is what's pointed out twice in that text. It's close to the palace. It's adjacent to his property. It's right on the other side of the fence. Maybe there's more bugs on that side of the fence. But Ahab knows if he can convert Nabot's inheritance to a vegetable garden for the palace, it's going to reduce the enormous cost of procuring food for his court. Because in the Middle East, the fields were outside the city, and then the people and the houses were inside the city. And so by the time you go outside the city, get the vegetables and so forth, load it onto the ox cart, get them back into the city, then they're not going to be as nice as if they were grown right next to the palace. If you could grow those fruits right next to the palace, they're going to be juicier, sweeter, crisper, brighter, which takes us right back to the garden. Genesis 3:6, the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. She took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband, and he ate. And so what does she see? The appeal. It's a delight. It's a pleasure. Fresh vegetables are so much better than all the wilted ones that have made the journey from the fields into Samaria. And we don't get the impression that Eve went a long way to get this fruit, like she had to pack a picnic basket to take it back to Adam. It just says she took it and ate it. She handed it to Adam. He ate it. It's convenient. And so they permitted themselves to eat under every green tree, which is part of our Torah portion. Deuteronomy 12:2. Do not worship under every green tree. Get rid of the idols. Where are the idols? They're going to be convenient. They're going to be close. They're going to be right under the fence. And so we know that trees are often metaphors of human beings in Scripture, just like the blood represents the sacrifice and the courage of the person. In the same way, a tree can be a metaphor of a human being. And a green tree especially, it looks like it has life in it. It's desirable. And that tree of the knowledge of good and evil reflected exactly what Adam and Eve desired, something beautiful, something to make them smarter, something that would please their taste buds. And I believe the hook went in when it was, you will be like God. You will be like Elohim. And that's where we can begin, like I said last night, we can crop, we can do all sorts of things to a picture to modify the picture and make it presented as something very, very beautiful. When if we could actually see what was surrounding the picture, we would realize that that picture has been taken out of context. And so that's what the seduction is all about. It pushes forth the most desirable aspects of the idol, and somehow the evil, the undesirability, the death, the darkness manages to recede, and all we see is how beautiful it is. And it's only after we eat of it and we become addicted to it that we are able to see the darkness, that we're able to see the big picture of wickedness, that we're able to see the dead ends. But by then, we're already hooked like a heroin addict to our own will. And that's the way the advertising world works. It gives us all sorts of concoctions and treatments that promise us we'll be more beautiful tomorrow, we'll be smarter tomorrow, we're going to have pleasure on our taste buds right now. If we'll just take a bite of this right now, if we'll eat this right now, everything is a matter of convenience. You wouldn't buy a product that promised to transform you into a beautiful person, but it took 50 years in order to work. You buy products that are going to make you beautiful tomorrow. Smarter tomorrow. Let me eat this, what is it, Prevagen or something that's supposed to help your memory. And of course, apparently there's no science to back it up, but it sells because what they're selling is the idea of recovering our memory, even though we're getting older and we're losing some of it. But just the promise that maybe you'll get me that edge back and I'll have the same memory that I had when I was 20 years old. We'll buy that stuff, even though we can look it up and there's no scientific evidence that it does work any more than a good diet. It's right now. In fact, if we go back to Revelation and look at that prophecy of a third of the trees burning up, if we look at trees as metaphors of human beings, and I believe in that context is asking us to see human beings, we can see that they are trees of idolatry. They're trees of self-image, because that's the promise of the serpent, the most cunning beast of the field. It's beautiful, Eve. You'll be beautiful if you eat this. It'll make you smart if you eat this. Won't this improve your self-image? And that's what the tree of the knowledge of good the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is. It's a place where we can go back and we can get our first instructions in idolatry. We don't teach kids about idolatry starting with the 10 Commandments. We teach kids about idolatry back in Genesis 2 and 3. Therefore, when they get to the later parts that do talk about carved images, they understand the root of the idol. And they can see that the tree is representing idolatry in its earliest form, as a seduction, as a promise of all the good things without the bad things that the Father has told us will go with it. An idol in its barest form is a sin of convenience. It delivers what I want, what I need, and what I want to be right now. I'm not going to have to wait 50 years. I'm not going to have to walk in the Word for 70 years to obtain wisdom. I can be smart right now. I can take a shortcut around what Elohim has set out as the pattern and the path for me. You know what? That long way around he gave me, I found a shortcut. And now all I have to do is figure out how I can convince him that the shortcut was his idea. It's just a matter of waiting, refusing to wait in the cool of the evening, to have that conversation with Elohim, being able to pray like Yeshua, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Because see, if we know that we want this thing so badly, and he's likely to forbid it to us, what do? We'll try to convince him, even in prayer, that it's what he wanted instead of what we wanted. Well, you want me to be wise, right? You want me to have the spirit of wisdom, so you would have wanted me to eat this fruit. And that's the problem with these conversations we have with Elohim. Rather than admit that we took a shortcut, that we took a path that he did not prescribe for us, and had we asked him first, he would have said no. Had we waited and had a conversation with him, an honest conversation with him, he would have said no. Instead, we try to twist it around and make him accept it. And we all do it. Or we have done it. Hopefully we're not still doing it. But since it's the oldest way of sinning, it's liable to be a continuing way of sinning. Trying to convince Adonai that our will is his will instead of asking what his will is and then let that be our will. And then their eyes were open. Look at this, you're naked. Because you can't force his will to be your will. And so Ahab, when he killed or took the vineyard, Jezebel had Naboth killed so that Ahab could have the vineyard. But what led up to it? Ahab did the exact same thing King Solomon did. He made a political marriage in order to tap into that trade network of the Sidonians. And in Yeshua's day, that's exactly what Herod Antipas did. When we look at the governors who persecuted Yeshua, remember at one point the Pharisees warned Yeshua, he says, Herod's sending people after you, you need to get out of here because he's going to try to kill you. And Yeshua said, you tell that fox. Yeshua wasn't scared. He had a mission and he had a message, and nothing was going to move him off of that prescribed mission and message. But that's what Herod Antipas did. He took his brother Philip's wife, Herodias, because he wanted to consolidate an adjacent territory. And in order to enlarge his territory, just like Ahab did with Naboth, That's what Herod did. He went ahead and had Philip murdered, and then took his brother Philip's wife. And then John the Baptist spoke against it and lost his head. And so that's what Jezebel did. She had Naboth murdered because Ahab coveted the vineyard, and Naboth would not sell it for money. It was his inheritance. But again, the key there is the vineyard was accessible. It was adjacent. It was close. And it would have made what he had larger. He wasn't looking for a property that was 50 kilometers away. This property is right next to mine. It's easy access. And so we have this symbolism of the vineyard. Psalm 128:3 says, your wife shall be like a fruitful vine within your house, your children like olive plants around your table. And so Yeshua calls Herod Antipas, you tell that fox. And we know that the foxes, the little foxes, spoil the vines. It says, for our vines have tender grapes. That's in Song of Songs 2:15. Pretty much what Yeshua is saying is that Herod Antipas is the little fox. He's like his father, Herod the Great, who did the same thing. If he had any competition, he murdered it and took what was theirs. So it's a way of saying that Ahab coveted Naboth's wife, i.e. his vineyard. Naboth recognizes his vineyard wife, I'm using air quotes there, is an inheritance from his father and then his father in heaven. It's a divine inheritance, not just from his natural father, but from his spiritual father above. He's been given an inheritance in the locked garden. And because the wife represents the vineyard and the vineyard represents the wife, it also represents the bride of the Holy One within that locked garden. The natural land of Israel is just teaching about these things that we can't yet see with the natural eye. And so Naboth, his name means fruits. Like Psalm says, he's producing these fruits in the garden to sit around the table. The children are called the olive plants. And in the Jewish tradition, it gives us this expectation of a communal meal. When we cross into the garden, it's said that the patriarchs will greet us, and then we will sit down and we will have a communal meal with the patriarchs of our faith when we do cross into the garden. And so what Ahab is seeking to do is much more than just a little story, a little bit of history. It has deep spiritual meaning, because what Ahab is seeking to destroy with the help of Jezebel is to destroy the inheritance of a place within the bride. And so Ahab's idolatrous wife is helping him to acquire this convenient vineyard. He's cutting off the fruits, or he thinks he is, of Naboth's inheritance. And so because Naboth just happened to be close, Uzi, sweetie, you're dreaming. Because he's close, he becomes a convenient meal for the fox. Kind of like Henny, Penny, and Billie Idol. And so the fox represents an idol or an idolater. Just like we're looking at the green tree, the convenient tree, the one that appears to have life, but it's exactly the opposite. And so Ahab covets the tender grapes, the tender plants of Adonai's vineyard. And in fact, the wine, if kind of goes back to our lessons about the fast, the feast, and why Daniel and his companions would have fasted meat and wine in ancient times. Not just, in fact, even in the temple and the Mishkan, there was a wine libation that was holy, that was pure. But also in idolatrous worship, there was wine libation, and there was also incantations and so forth dedicated to their gods over wine and meat. And in fact, to this day, Orthodox Jews will not drink even kosher wine that has either been opened or handled by a non-Jew, because still in their code of law is embedded that recognition that in ancient times it was routinely practiced to whisper incantations and dedications to their gods over wine and meat specifically. And meat, basar, the Hebrew word for meat, it's also a euphemism for carnal flesh. In other words, having this uncontrolled lust for meat can also become a craving for sexual activity. And as Moses is reviewing the wilderness journey, he reminds the Israelites of this pattern, that in the wilderness, when the Israelite men lusted for meat, then conveniently, who appears? The Midianites and the Moabite women. They invite them to a nice idolatrous meal, and then they begin to commit sexual acts using that phrase, under every green tree, because the women appear conveniently, the meal appears conveniently, then the idol appears conveniently, and so they become idol worshipers by committing adultery with these women and also committing idolatry, so that you can see the relationship between the two acts, that adultery is an act of idolatry, and idolatry is an act of adultery. It's a matter of the bride departing from her husband. But notice how convenient. They didn't have to go seek out the Moabite women. The women came to them. And when you look at the vegetable garden, it's translated out vegetable garden in English. But if you look at it, literally it's Lagan Yarak, which means a green garden. It's a dual word. Yarakot is greens, it's vegetables. And so yes, it's a vegetable garden, but you can also translate it as a green garden. What was he desiring? He was desiring that convenience of the vineyard. And so that's what we're told. Deuteronomy 12:2, it says, you shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree. Now, in this context, it's a different word for green. It's Strong 7488. And it does mean to be green, to be verdant, but it says by analogy, it's something new, figuratively prosperous, flourishing. So Ra'anan, instead of Yarak, which is green, Ra'anan describes the tree, and it gives us another perspective of what it means to commit idolatry under every green tree, especially when we go to the Gesenius entry. It gives us this clarity. It's not just green in color. Gesenius says it's metaphoric of happiness. And so it's telling you the bait of idolatry is going to be not just that it appears to have life, it appears to be green, not that it's just convenient, but it's also, the bait is also going to be prosperity. The bait is also going to be the promise of something new and fresh. And the bait is also going to be a promise of happiness. Now, every green tree. And where are we getting that? Why do we keep saying convenience? Because if you have ever been to the land of Israel, no matter where you are in that land, you're either going to see a mountain, a hill, or a green tree. That means the idolatry will be convenient. If anything, a short walk from where you are right now, something adjacent, something close. And so every green tree, how will you be lured into idolatry? It'll promise you happiness. It'll promise you something fresh and new. I'm tired of this old stuff. Let's have something new. And it'll promise you happiness. It'll promise you life now, but it's fake. It will promise this fake stuff so that it can destroy your eternal inheritance. We're not talking about salvation here. We're talking about inheritance, because that's what Navot was talking about. He says, this is my inheritance. And so we have an inheritance in the kingdom. And the more of this bait we fall for, the more the enemy is able to steal our inheritance from us. It also cautions us against false prophets and idolatrous cities. And when you read the Jewish commentaries, they tell us it concerns prophets who will lay claim to a sign or a miracle. And because the people want to believe the prophet, what are they promising? Something new, something fresh, something green, some promise of life. They're not typically promising only doom and gloom. Often what they're promising is exemption from doom and gloom. And so in that sense, they're still offering a promise of life, even though there might be doom and gloom around. But they say it's because the people want to believe the prophet, they become caught up in a growing community or group. And that's why it says a false prophet, but then it says it could happen to an entire city. It could happen to an entire community. And what they don't notice when they follow this false prophet, who's offering them this idol of something new, something fresh, something that's going to bring them pleasure, make them happy, make them wise. What they don't notice is how subtly the prophet's word are turning them away from acknowledging Adonai as the one and only Elohim. See, Moses is telling the people, by recapping the Chagim, the 3 foot festivals, where they're going to have to go up to the place where he sets his name, to Jerusalem. He's telling them that 3 times a year, you're going to have to overcome obstacles in order to worship together. The things that have been easy for you in the wilderness, to worship together at the Moedim and the Chagim, because there's no place else to go. You don't have that same freedom in the wilderness that you're going to have in the land to make the mistakes you're going to make. But the believers in this false prophet, they'll gather on hills, they'll gather on mountains, which represent sources of power, people groups. They can even be nations. They're high places. And so they will gravitate to these high places because they represent power to them in some way, whether that power is insight, whether that power is military might. There's all sorts of power that can seduce us. There's all sorts of pleasures that can seduce us. There's all sorts of promises of security that can seduce us. And what we end up doing is following the false prophet and losing our way to Jerusalem. Because somehow that new message that the false prophets brought to us, they were more convenient than the path to Jerusalem we were on. They're more stimulating. Remember, it's about newness, ra'anan. And that's what we have to be so careful. And so I looked up the Henny Penny story this morning. And for those of you who don't know the Henny Penny story, Henny Penny was a chicken. And depending on which story you read, either a pea or a nut fell on her head. And she thought the sky was falling. And she had to go tell the king that the sky was falling. And as she goes through the farm, she's gathering up other animals who believe her. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. And they're like, oh, really? Yeah, we have to go tell the king. And so they form this little community. They gather up because they believed her message that somehow heaven's failing. Somehow heaven's falling. Well, heaven's not going to fail. But they believed her sign, that something, a piece of heaven fell on her head. And so as they're walking along the path to go tell the king, Foxy Loxy comes out. And he thinks, oh, winter chicken dinner and turkey and goose and duck, and it's going to be a great night. Just like Henny Penny and Billy Idol ended up being winter chicken dinner last Thursday night. And so as they're talking to Foxy Loxy, and he's trying to lure them into his mountain cave there, he says, oh, I'll go with you. But first come and rest in my cave. Let's do something convenient. And all of a sudden, a nut falls on the fox's head. And the group realizes, hey, wait a minute, the sky wasn't falling. It was just something fell on her head. But they were nearly eaten by the fox because they believed the false prophet. And I'm sure, that the moral of the story too is that the more people Henny Penny tells that the sky is falling, the more self-important she feels because now they're following her. But see, in order to follow her, you would have to ignore a fundamental truth. Heaven doesn't fail. Heaven's not going to fall. It might descend upon us at an appointed time in history, but the sky is not going to fall on your head. The judgments might fall on your head. And so misperception, sometimes we just know the sky is falling. And we're willing to follow somebody who tells us the sky is falling, but they're leading us down that game trail to Foxy Loxy's house. And they're asking us to ignore all those passages in scripture that tell us the sky is not going to fail. Heaven is not going to fail us. So we serve an idol when we serve our self-image. Human beings are created in the image of Elohim. They are not Elohim. And so for our people group, our unique people group, whatever you call it, Messianic, Hebrew roots, Torah observant, Torah directed, Torah learning, we have to be really, really careful that the newness of the Torah doesn't turn us into these little self-important messengers like Henny Penny, who believe everything that falls on our heads from every green tree is the truth. Because the greater tragedy than deliberately going out and serving idols on the mountains, the hills, and under every green tree would be, what if you did make that journey? What if you did make it all the way to Jerusalem, to the holy city, and what you found is that the journey had not transformed you by the Spirit, but you arrived there and you're still working on your self-image. And that's the whole thing about an image. If you look at the carved images, they usually have the form of either a human or a beast. And again, the answer is yes, that's accurate. A person who serves something created is just working on their self-image. A human who does not serve Adonai is reduced to the image of a beast. He serves his own soul like a beast. He's going to serve his appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. And he will practice his life in a more convenient manner than one who's going to have a life walk of learning how to submit his soul to his spirit. An idolater will serve, I want, I feel, I crave, I think, the beast. Because they're very quickly and very easily gratified. You can be beautiful tomorrow. We'll take years off of you, honey. Just eat this. You're going to be strong. You're going to, they promise everything. But the appetite we're supposed to acquire through the power of the Holy Spirit, really the results are not so tangible on this side of the garden. They might be less tangible, and therefore they're not as attractive to those who serve the beast because they're held in trust. And we can see there's a pattern there. The Israelites, they had difficulty being satisfied with spiritual bread and spiritual water and divine discipline. They preferred the natural. And now that Moses is releasing them into the promised land, they're going to have to check to see if they have built up a resistance to the beast, to this desire for instant gratification that idolatry offers, whether they will worship under every green tree. He says, okay, now I'm giving you your freedom. Now it's going to be your responsibility to come up to the Mishkan, or to come up to the future Mikdash with the community of faith, rather than try to escape it. Hard to escape it in the wilderness with Moses. But once you get into the land, now you have this great freedom. But will you continue to share that sense of community as you go up to the Moedim, as you go up to the Chagim? Even when you slaughter animals for your own consumption, will you share the portions with your family, with the priest, with the Levite, with the poor? And he's telling them, it's going to be a much greater sacrifice for you to journey to Jerusalem than you're accustomed to in the wilderness. You didn't have to go that far. Now I'm telling you, it's going to be more difficult and more costly. Your freedom is going to cost you something. And so here's what Rabbi Kahn wrote about this transition. He says, the mountains, hills, and trees in this verse seem an apt description of the land of Israel, but this is no innocuous guide to the landscape. This seemingly benign phrase provides insight into the psyche, into the soul of the sinner. The land of Israel is full of mountains, hills, and trees. A person who wanted to serve his idol could easily and immediately turn to any available mountain, hill, or tree. This made idolatry extremely accessible. It was a wonderful solution, an instant salve for those in need of immediate gratification. And then he goes on in that text, and he discusses how difficult spiritual growth can be, especially when we compare it to the minimal demands that idolatry places upon us, with this bait of convenience, happiness, newness. And he points out that no matter how you try to get to Jerusalem and Israel, it's going to be an arduous climb. It's a foot festival. They use their feet and they use donkeys to get there. And either way, either your feet or your hind end are going to be sore when you get there. And so he says, no matter how you get to Jerusalem, it's going to cost you something. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be an effort, because Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains. And so it's like that locked garden, the Garden of Eden, my inheritance. Salvation just doesn't require that much work on our part. We accept the sacrifice of the lamb, the blood on the doorpost, but that's just opening the door. He points out that spiritual growth is only going to come through hard work. It's only going to come through long hours invested in the kingdom. It's only going to come through honest soul searching. And sometimes, and this is my 2 cents worth, it's going to require periods of withdrawals, like a heroin addict, because our soul addictions to our self-will, once we identify those areas of self-will and we say, hey, wait a minute, I'm no longer going to try to force Elohim to accept my will as his will. Instead, I accept his will as my will. But because I have allowed my soul to become addicted to myself, I'm going to go through a period of withdrawals. If I try to wean myself away from all these new things, all these convenient things that don't require that much effort, that give me immediate fun and happiness. But see, that happiness doesn't last forever because it's like an addiction. You have to do something again tomorrow, even more tremendous than you did yesterday. And that's why I say be careful with your Torah study, that it's not reduced to simply finding the next new thing that you can impress people with, like Henny Penny, the sky is falling. That's not our job. Our job is to be transformed by that word so that if people do follow us, they will follow us because they see the transformation of the word in our hearts. That we have not settled for the convenient things. Because if we settled for the convenient things, then they wouldn't see the transformation. And who would want to follow that? So sending them to Jerusalem as a place of worship was meant to transform the worshiper because of the great effort and the sacrifice of the soul to attain Jerusalem. And so for this reason in the portion, you see, okay, he said it would be a great burden for you to have to carry an animal to Jerusalem just to slaughter it for normal consumption. So now you've got the freedom to slaughter that animal. As long as it's not a sacrificial one, you now have the freedom and the obligation to slaughter it. In fact, for the feast, you don't have to carry a sacrificial animal all the way there. You could turn it into money. Take the money in your hand. I'll lighten that load for you because the journey to Jerusalem is going to be difficult enough. And so what he's telling us is, I'm not trying to place unnecessary burdens on you to make it to the Moedim. I'm giving you lots of freedom. So he's not making the journey easy. He's making it attainable. And we can see the Father's work in this Torah portion, adjusting here, adjusting there, the same way a good father on this earth would do. If you make things too easy for your children, they don't appreciate the freedom that they have. If you overburden them, then they give up. Either way, it makes them more susceptible to idolatry. And so you can see that the Father's trying to load the donkey at just the right weight so that we will feel the obstacles. We see we can't be an overcomer if there's nothing to overcome. The book of Revelation is all about being an overcomer. How are you overcoming? You are overcoming on this journey to Jerusalem. You are overcoming on this journey to a place where his word is not a burden, it's a privilege. And it's engaged with full freedom of heart because we were responsible with the obligations along the journey. And so here's Psalm 125, which is a psalm of ascents. It says, those who trust in the Lord are as Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forever. In other words, when we make that journey to Jerusalem, we are making the journey to the sealed garden. He's given us the keys that unlock the garden. And so when we go to Jerusalem, it's because we see into a kingdom and see into a realm that the rest of the world cannot see and just thinks it's too much trouble. There's too many mountains to cross. There's too many obstacles to overcome. But if we will overcome and cross those mountains and not worship on those mountains, if we will enjoy the shade of those trees without eating from those trees, then we can come to the sealed garden. We can go up to the Garden of Eden, and it abides forever. And the idea is, as we go into Jerusalem, as we go into his feasts, he reminds us that those same mountains that were obstacles for us, they're now protecting us. the very effort we put forth in overcoming these obstacles are a way of spiritually elevating us to the point where we look back on the journey and say, you know what, every obstacle I overcame has now become something that surrounds me with protection because it was divinely ordained in my life. And I didn't reject it in favor of something new, easy, convenient. I didn't stop and camp on the mountain. I didn't stop and camp under the tree. I got up and I kept going. And therefore I cannot be moved. I will abide forever. So we're just walking into the Father's arms. That's the whole idea, is to be transformed by the journey itself. Inheriting Jerusalem is the reward, just like Navot. Why would I give you my inheritance? You can't substitute something easy for the journey. And so we can't worship under every green tree of distraction. That's exactly what happened to the 10 tribes. Jeroboam made them more accessible altars so they wouldn't have to walk so far. But you realize by making it more convenient, he denied them that challenging journey to Jerusalem that they needed, because 3 times a year they built themselves up as a community of faith. As they walked to Jerusalem together, family units would go together. We see that in the time of Yeshua. Town and city groups would travel together, and the numbers would grow and grow and grow as other towns and cities and families joined in that journey to Jerusalem, and they would begin singing the songs of ascent. And the more people that joined in, the greater the song, the louder the song. And if you think of it, it was a difficult journey, but if you do it with people, you learn to establish yourself in a community of faith, and you don't realize how fast the journey is going. And you may not notice that it's as difficult as you thought it was. Looking back in American history, the greatest songs that we have are those songs of longing to cross over the Jordan, those songs for Canaan land, inheriting Canaan land. Those were the American spirituals that slaves sung when they worked in the fields. Imagine the level of hardship they endured. The song made it bearable. The vision of returning, of crossing the Jordan, of ascending to Jerusalem, of inheriting Canaan land, it made life bearable. It made an unbearable life bearable. How did they accomplish the work on the railroads? The same way. They sang songs together, and the songs gave them the rhythm. And the harder the work, the more important it was for them to sing. Having unity, having coordination is vital in this part of our life journey as we're overcoming the obstacles to Jerusalem. We can't be distracted by something convenient that won't be as difficult. And so these roads of Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, they do lead to Jerusalem, and that's what the Torah portion ends with. This is the Father's way of gathering us into his arms of protection, his sealed garden. And so when we gather according to his will, his times, with his congregation, we're conforming to his image rather than vainly trying to force his will into our image. And so many lies have been told from the Garden of Eden until now, because human beings always want to bend his ways to our own convenience, when the path that he has set before us is the path that leads into his arms, into walking with him in the cool of the evening. And so this freedom that we enjoy, it comes with a great obligation to surmount those obstacles of returning to Jerusalem together. That's the whole idea of the Torah portion. Will you continue to be a community in spite of all the freedom that you have. Because if you look at the cycle of the feast, there is no Sukkot with the bride under the chuppah unless we personally balance our books at Rosh Hashanah, at the Feast of Trumpets, and unless we balance our books as a community at Yom HaKippurim. Those two things, you have to cross through those obstacles to go under the chuppah. So you don't really get Sukkot if you don't follow that path. There's no shortcut to it. There's no green tree that's going to substitute for it. And game trails do lead to deadfalls. There's no playing games. Once he draws you to him and his covenant, it's time to quit playing games under the trees of convenience. Because along the way, on those roads, those mountains, those hills, and under those trees that do lead to Jerusalem, there's going to be some old foxes that are waiting to steal away the bride, to spoil the vineyard. And if you walk in the Father's way, you are going to pass a lot of green trees. And that old fox is going to try to destroy your inheritance in the garden. When you misunderstand your freedom, when your freedom within the word, you perceive as being freedom from the word. When you find a nice green tree, that's not Yom Kippur thinking. At Yom Kippur, we stand as a nation. And in fact, the customs of marriage match the feast of Yom Kippur. The couple will even fast on the day of their marriage, just like on Yom Kippur. And so the fox, I did not put this on that chicken, by the way. I found this picture. I do not dress up chickens. That's what we have to be careful of. That in this freedom, in the places where we were called, that we don't disconnect ourselves from a community of faith. And it might be too late for Billy Idol and Henny Penny, but it's not too late for us. And so here's your homework. It says, along with Luke 13:22 through 35, look up each of the verses over here to the right and study them in their contexts. What I want you to look for is how each of those contexts illustrates some aspect of the themes that we've gone over in Re'eh. And then I put a recap there. And then I added the one that I felt like we were talking about the whole time. So in addition to the last bullet point is the obstacles of inconvenience between us and Jerusalem, as well as the garden above. And then the chart I was telling you about, remember we kind of started with, will you continue to give portions when you have the freedom not to? This is the charts of the tithes that just kind of crystallizes how that works. So it describes the title of that particular tithe on the left, and then the graphic on the right has it broken down into a chart with check marks so that you can see what tithe would be required over 7 years' time, if that helps. And the reason I put that on there was because your first bullet point had to do with celebrating Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot in Jerusalem, as well as the tithes that you would bring to those three feasts. And I want you thinking about who would be ministered to by those tithes. Okay, so I think I've left it up there long enough. You can see it on the recording.